This story differs from our usual format. What follows is a direct testimony, a first-person account from someone who witnessed these events firsthand during 37 years of captivity in the American South between 1809 and 1846. My name is Samuel Pritchard, and for 37 years, I was the property of another man. For longer than I care to remember, I've kept silent about what I witnessed on that Virginia plantation. But before I depart this world, the truth must be told. What happened there wasn't merely the familiar cruelty of bondage. It was something that twisted the very nature of human suffering into shapes I still cannot fully comprehend. The official records indicate Riverside Plantation operated from 1809 until it burned in 1846. What those records fail to mention is why 17 slaves vanished from the property books within a single month, or why the Harrow family interred 3 generations in unmarked graves on the eastern ridge. I was present. I witnessed what they did, and I witnessed what it cost them. Before we proceed with my testimony, there's something you need to understand. There exist witnesses to history, and then there are those forced to participate in its darkest experiments. I occupied both roles. If you're listening to this account, I ask that you leave a comment telling me where you're from, north or south, city or country. This story belongs to all of us, whether we choose to claim it or not. And if you believe the past deserves remembrance, no matter how uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel. The dead deserve their testimony. What I'm about to share began long before I understood what I was observing. It began with a promise made between desperate men during a year when cotton prices fell and pride became more valuable than gold. I was born in 1809, the same year Thomas Hargrove purchased 200 acres of bottomland along the James River, 20 miles south of Richmond. My mother belonged to the previous owner, and when the property changed hands, so did we. 15 souls in total, though that number would fluctuate in ways that still haunt my sleep. Riverside wasn't the largest plantation in Chesterfield County, but Thomas Hargrove possessed ambitions that exceeded his means. He was a tall man with narrow shoulders and eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke. His wife, Catherine, was the daughter of a Richmond merchant who'd made his fortune in tobacco before the soil gave out. She brought money to the marriage, though not enough to satisfy Thomas's vision of himself as a Virginia gentleman. The main house stood on a rise overlooking the river. A 2-story structure with white columns that were always slightly off-center, as if the building itself recognized it was pretending to be something it wasn't. Behind it stretched the quarters where we lived. 12 cabins arranged in 2 rows, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 of us, depending on the season and Thomas's financial fortunes. I was 7 years old when I first understood that something at Riverside distinguished it from the other plantations I'd heard about from the field hands occasionally hired from neighboring properties. It wasn't the work. We all understood work. We understood the ache in your bones that never quite left. We understood hands that bled and backs that screamed. It was the watching. Thomas Hargrove observed us with an intensity that exceeded the usual overseer scrutiny. He carried a leather journal everywhere, making marks with a pencil he'd sharpen against a small wet stone. Years later, I learned he was recording us. Not merely our work output, though that was part of it, but something else. Our habits, our relationships, our breaking points. My mother worked in the big house as a cook. My father, though Thomas never recognized such bonds, was a man named Jacob who worked the tobacco fields. I had 2 sisters, Ruth, who was 9, and Mary, barely 3 years old. We lived in the cabin closest to the main house, which meant my mother could be summoned at any hour and frequently was. The other slaves at Riverside came from various places. There was old Daniel, who claimed to remember Africa, though no one quite believed him. There was Esther and her husband Benjamin, who'd been sold together from a plantation in North Carolina. There were the field hands, Moses, Isaac, Elijah, and young Thomas, called Little Thomas to distinguish him from our owner. There was Sarah, who helped my mother in the kitchen, and her daughter Grace, who was close to Ruth's age. And there was Augustus. Augustus remained a mystery even to us. He'd arrived at Riverside 3 years before my birth, purchased at auction in Richmond for a sum that made other plantation owners laugh at Thomas's foolishness. Augustus possessed literacy, a dangerous thing in a slave, as we all knew. He'd been educated by his previous owners' children, taught alongside them until the family fell into debt and had to sell their property piece by piece. Augustus was the last to go. Thomas Hargrove purchased him specifically for his learning. He made Augustus a house servant, had him manage the plantation's records, track supplies, and even teach young Richard Harrove, Thomas's only son, his letters and numbers. The other slaves didn't quite know what to make of Augustus. He occupied a small room off the kitchen, ate better food than the rest of us, and wore tailored rather than roughly sewn clothes. Yet he remained a slave. And that fundamental truth bound him to us in ways that transcended his privileges. The year I turned 7, 1816, marked when the watching intensified. Thomas had made a poor investment in a cotton gin that never worked properly, and his creditors were circling. I didn't understand the economics then, but I understood the tension in the air, the way Catherine's voice grew sharper when addressing the house servants, the way Thomas's journal entries became longer and more frequent. That year also marked Elijah's disappearance. Elijah was a field hand, perhaps 20 years old, with a strong back and a quiet disposition that kept him from trouble. He'd been born on a South Carolina plantation and sold north when his owner died. He rarely spoke of his past, but once I heard him tell Moses that he'd had a wife down south, sold away while pregnant with their first child. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Elijah failed to appear at morning muster. This was unusual. The punishment for tardiness was severe enough that even the sick would drag themselves to the yard behind the main house where Thomas counted us each dawn. My mother later told me that Thomas's face had gone pale when Elijah didn't appear, and he'd sent 2 field hands to check the man's cabin. Elijah was gone. His few possessions remained: the spare shirt, a carving of a bird he'd been working on, the thin blanket we all slept under. But Elijah himself had vanished. Thomas ordered a search. We checked the tobacco barns, the storage sheds, the smokehouse. We walked the property boundaries, examining the woods that bordered the southern edge. We searched for 2 full days while the tobacco that needed harvesting sat in the fields, and Thomas's face grew darker with each passing hour. They never found Elijah. Not then. What they did find 3 days after his disappearance was his shirt floating in the river about a mile downstream. It was torn, stained with something dark that might have been blood or might have been river mud. Thomas held it up during evening muster, his face unreadable. Elijah attempted to run, he announced. The river took him. Let this serve as a lesson about the price of freedom attempted too rashly. But I stood close enough to see Thomas's hand shaking as he held that shirt. I stood close enough to see him glance toward the eastern ridge, where the ground rose toward the tree line and the old family cemetery sat behind its wrought iron fence. My mother wouldn't speak of it, but that night I heard her praying in a way I'd never heard before, not asking for deliverance or mercy, but asking for protection from something she refused to name. 2 weeks later, little Thomas, the field hand not the owner's son, complained of stomach pains. By evening, he was dead. The doctor Thomas Hargrove summoned from Richmond called it bowel inflammation and charged Thomas $5 for the visit. We buried little Thomas in the slave cemetery beyond the quarters, and Thomas made a notation in his journal, his pencil moving quickly across the page. That's when I first noticed the pattern, though I was too young to understand what I was seeing. Every time someone died or disappeared, Thomas would spend hours in his study, poring over his journals by lamplight. Augustus would be summoned, and they would talk in low voices behind the closed door. If you're wondering what could drive a man to such careful documentation of human suffering, hit that like button and leave your thoughts in the comments. What I'm about to tell you next demonstrates how a ledger of souls can transform into an instruction manual for something far darker than simple bondage. The years following Elijah's disappearance settled into a rhythm of watching and being watched. I grew from a child into a young man, and with that growth came a deeper understanding of the machinery of Riverside Plantation. By age 14, I'd been assigned to work alongside Augustus, learning to read and write despite the laws forbidding it. Thomas required someone to assist with his increasingly complex record-keeping, and my mother had bargained her own increased kitchen hours for my education. Those hours in Thomas's study, copying figures and letters under Augustus's patient instruction, granted me access to something most slaves never saw, the mind of their owner laid bare on paper. Thomas's journals weren't simply plantation records. They were experiments in human durability. He recorded how long a person could work in August heat before collapsing. He documented which family separations caused the most visible grief and which seemed endured with resignation. He noted which punishments produced immediate compliance and which bred long-term resentment. He tracked everything: birth rates, death rates, attempted escapes, and what he called optimal ratios of hope to despair. Augustus never spoke directly about what we were reading. Yet sometimes his hand would pause over a page, and I'd see something flicker across his face. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow, but something containing elements of both. He thinks we're mathematics, Augustus told me once, his voice barely a whisper. He thinks if he can just find the right equation, he can make us profitable and prevent us from running. He fails to understand that we're not numbers. We're testimonies waiting to be given. In 1823, when I was 14, Thomas Hargrove traveled to Richmond and returned with a man named Dr. Silas Winthrop. Winthrop was thin and severe with wire-rimmed spectacles and a black medical bag that never left his side. He stayed at Riverside for 3 weeks, examining each slave with attention that extended far beyond checking for obvious illness. He measured our skulls with calipers. He tested our reflexes and pain responses. He inquired about our parentage, our health histories, our dreams and fears. And Thomas stood beside him throughout, making notes. Always making notes. They're trying to prove something, Augustus told me one evening as we filed papers in the study. Thomas and Winthrop were at dinner, and we enjoyed a rare moment of privacy. A debate is occurring in the medical societies about whether we're fully human or some intermediate species. Winthrop is gathering evidence. I was young enough that the full implications hadn't yet settled into my bones. Evidence of what? That we don't experience pain the same way they do. That we're built for labor the way horses are built for pulling plows. That ownership isn't merely legal, it's natural. Augustus showed me a letter in Thomas's desk, one Winthrop had written after his visit. In it, the doctor praised Thomas's meticulous documentation of Negro physiology and temperament and encouraged him to continue his observations, particularly around what he called stress thresholds and recovery patterns. That letter bore the date May 15, 1823. 3 months later, my sister Ruth disappeared. Ruth was 16, possessing my mother's quick smile and my father Jacob's steady hands. She worked the fields during planting and harvest and assisted in the big house during slower seasons. She sang while she worked, hymns mostly, though sometimes she'd create her own words to melodies she'd heard from hired hands arriving from other plantations. She vanished on a Sunday, our one partial day of rest. My mother had last seen her after the midday meal, walking toward the river with a basket to gather blackberries. When sunset arrived and Ruth hadn't returned, my mother's composure, the careful mask she'd worn for 17 years of bondage, finally cracked. Thomas organized a search, but it felt perfunctory, as if he already knew it would yield nothing. They found Ruth's basket overturned on the riverbank, blackberries scattered across the mud. They found footprints leading toward the water, and then nothing. The river, Thomas said again, employing the same words he'd used for Elijah 7 years earlier. It's treacherous this time of year. The current runs stronger than it appears. But Ruth could swim. We'd all learned in that river, knew its moods and dangers, and I'd examined her footprints in that mud. She'd been standing still, not running toward the water. The prints surrounding hers told a different story, larger prints, boots, not bare feet, multiple sets converging on where she'd been standing. My mother aged a decade in the following week. She stopped singing in the kitchen. She stopped speaking except when directly addressed. And at night, I'd wake to hear her crying with a sound like something being torn from her chest. My father, Jacob, attempted his own investigation. He questioned the other field hands, searched the property during whatever spare moments he could find. 2 weeks after Ruth disappeared, Jacob was sold to a Georgia plantation. Thomas informed us at morning muster, his face impassive, that Jacob had proven troublesome and required removal for the stability of Riverside's workforce. I never saw my father again. This is what they omit from the histories: how resistance was punished through erasure. How the act of asking questions could result in permanent separation from everyone you loved. But I'm recording it now in my own way, speaking it into whatever future might listen. Thomas's journals from that period grew even more detailed. He recorded my mother's grief in clinical terms. Subject displays diminished work capacity following family disruption. Recovery timeline estimated for 4 to 6 weeks. Note: emotional attachment to offspring creates operational vulnerability. Augustus allowed me to read those entries. I believe he wanted me to comprehend the full scope of what we inhabited. Not merely slavery, but slavery observed and documented as if we were specimens in some grand natural history of human suffering. They're constructing a science of us, Augustus said. Every observation, every measurement, every notation about how we respond to loss, they're creating a manual for more efficient human ownership. The year I turned 17, Catherine Harrow fell ill. The Richmond doctors couldn't diagnose her ailment. She simply grew weaker, unable to keep food down, her skin acquiring a yellowish cast. Thomas spent a fortune on treatments, patent medicines, special diets, even summoning a Baltimore physician who specialized in women's disorders. Nothing helped. She died in the spring of 1826 on a morning when apple blossoms fell like snow across the property. Thomas secluded himself in his study for 3 days. When he emerged, he resembled a man who'd made a terrible calculation and decided to proceed with it anyway. Young Richard, then 18, assumed some of his father's duties. He was a softer version of Thomas, not kind exactly, but less obsessed with documentation, more interested in the mechanical aspects of plantation management. He treated us as property requiring maintenance rather than mysteries requiring solution. For a brief period, life at Riverside became almost ordinary. The watching diminished. The journal sat closed on Thomas's desk. We worked. We endured. The seasons turned in their reliable pattern. But by then I'd learned that calm at Riverside was always temporary, merely the pause between one experiment and the next. The calm lasted nearly 2 years. During that time, I continued working with Augustus, managing the plantation's records and absorbing everything possible from the books in Thomas's library. He never explicitly granted me permission to read them, but he never explicitly forbade it either. And Augustus interpreted that ambiguity as license to educate me. I read about agriculture and animal husbandry, about Virginia's history and the principles of what they called scientific plantation management. I read Thomas Jefferson's writings on slavery, his elaborate justifications twisted into philosophical knots. I read treatises on human varieties and racial characteristics, all authored by men who'd never spent a day in bondage yet felt qualified to explain our nature to the world. And I read Thomas's journals, every volume I could access. What I discovered was that Riverside wasn't merely a plantation. It was a laboratory. Thomas had corresponded with other plantation owners, sharing his observations and receiving theirs in return. A network of them existed, scattered across Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Men who viewed themselves as pioneers in what they called rational slavery. They believed that by applying scientific principles to human ownership, they could resolve the economic inefficiencies plaguing the institution. The letters overflowed with questions. What ratio of punishment to reward produced optimal work output? How much food was truly necessary to maintain health versus how much was wasted on comfort? What family structures, if any, should be preserved or encouraged? How could the inherent human desire for freedom be systematically crushed or redirected? They discussed these questions the way naturalists discuss bird migrations or crop rotations, with clinical detachment, as if the subjects under examination weren't human beings who experience pain and love and hope. One letter in particular, from a planter named Harrison in South Carolina, described what he called strategic disappearances. He discovered that occasional unexplained absence from the slave population generated a useful level of fear, not panic, which proved counterproductive, but a steady background anxiety that discouraged organized resistance or escape attempts. Let them wonder, Harrison wrote. Let them create their own explanations. The uncertainty proves more effective than any punishment. Thomas had underlined that passage 3 times. In 1828, when I was 19, Augustus summoned me to the study late one evening. Thomas and Richard were in Richmond settling some business with Thomas's creditors. We had the house to ourselves. "You need to know where she is," Augustus said without preamble. I knew immediately he meant Ruth. "Tell me." Augustus produced a key from his pocket, a key I'd never seen before, and led me from the main house toward the eastern ridge. We walked in darkness, the moon hidden behind clouds, until we reached the family cemetery where generations of harrows lay behind that wrought iron fence. But we didn't stop at the fence. Augustus led me past it into the woods beyond, to a small clearing I'd never noticed before. In the center of the clearing lay a depression in the ground, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, marked at one end by a plain river stone. "There are 14 of them," Augustus said quietly. 14 stones, 14 people who didn't die of disease or accident but were disappeared. When Thomas needed to demonstrate the cost of resistance, or independence, or simply existing in a way that threatened his experiments. I felt my legs weaken. Ruth, the 6th stone from the north. She'd been asking questions about the journals, talking to some of the other field hands about what they recorded. Thomas couldn't risk her sharing what she knew. "You've known this whole time." My voice emerged strangled. "Why didn't you tell someone?" Augustus turned to me, and in the darkness, I could barely distinguish his expression. "Tell who?" "The county sheriff who dines at Thomas's table. The Richmond authorities who depend on plantation owners for their tax base. The other slaves possessing no legal standing to testify against a white man. I've been documenting it, Samuel. Everything. Every disappearance, every death, every experiment. I'm creating a counter-ledger to his journals. Testimony for some future court that might actually listen." He withdrew a wrapped bundle from inside his coat, papers covered in his careful handwriting. "But I needed someone younger to carry this forward. I'm 48 years old, Samuel. I've already outlived most of us. You're going to outlive this place. And when you do, you're going to tell this story." Just when I believed I'd grasped the full scope of horror at Riverside, Augustus's revelations opened a new depth of darkness. "If this testimony affects you, share it with someone who needs to understand what history contains. Hit that like button if you believe these stories deserve telling, and subscribe to ensure you hear how this account concludes. Now, let me tell you what happened when Thomas returned from Richmond and discovered that Augustus had shown me the clearing. Thomas knew. I never discovered how, whether he'd set some trap we'd sprung, or whether one of the house servants had observed us and reported back. But 3 days after Augustus showed me the graves, Thomas summoned us both to his study. He sat behind his desk, Richard standing beside him, and between them on the polished wood surface lay Augustus's hidden papers, the counter-ledger, every careful notation, every documented death, every piece of evidence against Thomas Harrow's experiments in human suffering. "Augustus," Thomas said, his voice perfectly calm. "You've been keeping unauthorized records." Augustus stood perfectly still beside me. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that literacy in a slave is illegal in Virginia? That maintaining such records constitutes incitement to rebellion?" "Yes, sir." Thomas picked up one of the pages, studied it with apparent interest. "Remarkably detailed work. You've documented every death on this property for the past 20 years. You've included circumstances, your observations about cause, even speculation about intent." He set the page down carefully. "You've essentially written a criminal indictment of me." "I've written the truth, sir." The ensuing silence seemed to stretch for hours. I stood frozen, waiting for violence, for rage, for whatever punishment Thomas deemed appropriate for such profound betrayal. Instead, Thomas smiled. "The truth," he repeated. "Yes, I suppose you have. And do you know what's remarkable, Augustus? It changes nothing. You could publish these papers in the Richmond Inquirer tomorrow, and it would change nothing. You could testify before a judge, a jury, the governor himself, and your words would carry no legal weight whatsoever. You are property documenting the actions of your owner. Your testimony is inadmissible. Your truth is voiceless. He gathered the papers together, tapped them into a neat stack, and then fed them one by one into the fireplace. We watched as 20 years of careful documentation burned to ash. However, Thomas continued, the fact that you attempted this does create a problem. Not a legal problem, a practical one. You've demonstrated that you think of yourself as more than you are. That you imagine yourself as some kind of witness rather than what you actually are, my property, serving my purposes. He turned to me. Samuel, you've been learning from Augustus. Have you been assisting him with this project? Every instinct screamed for me to lie, to claim ignorance, but I'd watched Augustus stand firm in his truth, and something within me refused to betray that courage. No, sir, I said, but I knew about it. Thomas nodded slowly. Honesty. That's interesting. He made a note in his journal, even now, always documenting. You're 20 years old, Samuel. You possess potential value. You read and write better than Richard here. Frankly, you could prove useful for many years yet, but I need to ascertain that you understand your position. He stood, walked to where Augustus and I stood. Your sister grasped something important at the end. She grasped that resistance carries consequences. Your father grasped it too, though selling him away proved necessary to teach that lesson. The question is, must I teach you the same way, or have you learned from their examples? I had 1 second to make a choice that would define the rest of my life, stand with Augustus in open resistance and be disappeared like Ruth, or bow my head and survive to carry the testimony forward as Augustus had intended. I bowed my head. I understand my position, sir. Good. Thomas returned to his desk. Then here's what's going to happen. Augustus, you're going to be sold. I've already arranged it with a trader in Richmond. He specializes in difficult cases. Slaves requiring removal far enough that their influence cannot spread. Georgia, probably, maybe Alabama. Somewhere you can start fresh without the burden of all these ideas about truth and testimony. Augustus's face remained impassive, but I observed his hands clench briefly at his sides. Samuel, Thomas continued, you're going to assume all of Augustus's duties. You'll manage the records, handle correspondence, assist Richard with plantation administration. And you're going to do it knowing that any repetition of Augustus's behavior will result not in your own punishment, but in the sale of your mother and your youngest sister, Mary. Do we understand each other? Yes, sir. Excellent. Richard, escort Augustus to the quarters and ensure he's secured until the trader arrives tomorrow. As Richard led Augustus away, the older man caught my eye for just a moment. He didn't appear angry or betrayed. He appeared like a man who'd completed his life's work and was ready to face whatever came next. That night, I lay awake in my cabin, staring at the ceiling and contemplating that clearing in the woods. 14 stones, 14 people whose truths had been buried. And now Augustus would be gone, sold away before he could share his knowledge with anyone else. But Thomas had made a miscalculation. He believed he'd won by burning the papers and removing Augustus. What he failed to realize was that I'd spent 2 years reading those papers, memorizing them, internalizing every detail of his experiments and their consequences. The ledger wasn't gone. It had merely transferred to a different kind of storage, one that couldn't be burned or sold away. The trader arrived at dawn. His name was Crocker, a thick-shouldered man with a beard stained yellow from tobacco and hands that appeared comfortable with violence. He shackled Augustus and loaded him into a wagon along with 2 other slaves purchased from a neighboring plantation. As the wagon pulled away, Augustus looked back at Riverside one final time. Our eyes met across the distance, and I observed him nod once, a gesture conveying everything he couldn't speak aloud: remember, document, testify. I never saw Augustus again. But 31 years later, when I finally gained my freedom, my first action was attempting to discover what happened to him. I traced him through bills of sale and plantation records, through the whispered networks of people tracking lost family members. He'd been sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama, where he lived another 8 years before dying of what the records called consumption. But before his death, he taught 6 other slaves to read and write. And one of them taught 6 more. And those silent testimonies passed hand to hand in darkness became part of the great ledger of crimes that would eventually be called to account. But that appears later in the story. In 1828, I was 20 years old, and I had just agreed to serve the man who'd murdered my sister and driven my father away. The years following Augustus's departure were the longest of my captivity. I remained trapped in a position of relative privilege, working in the main house, managing records, eating better food than the field hands, while knowing the full scope of what that privilege cost. Every number I entered in Thomas's ledgers represented quantified human suffering. Every letter I copied for his correspondence with other plantation owners spread his philosophy of systematic dehumanization. I became what Augustus had been, a witness with access but no voice. Documentation without the power to accuse. The difference was that I now comprehended the complete architecture of what Thomas had constructed. This wasn't merely a plantation. It was a prototype, a model that other owners were studying and attempting to replicate across Virginia and the deeper South. Thomas's correspondence increased during this period. Letters arrived weekly from plantation owners in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, even as far as Mississippi. They posed detailed questions. How did Thomas maintain discipline without excessive physical punishment that might reduce work capacity? What ratio of family units to single workers produced optimal stability? How could the natural human desire for literacy be suppressed without generating resentment leading to sabotage or flight? I read every letter. I memorized the names: Harrison in Charleston, Whitfield in Raleigh, Peyton in Natchez. I noted their questions and Thomas's responses, creating a mental map of this network of men who believed they could perfect the machinery of human bondage through careful observation and documentation. By 1833, when I was 24, Thomas had begun hosting what he called agricultural symposiums at Riverside. These were gatherings of like-minded plantation owners who would spend 3 or 4 days discussing their methods, sharing their findings, and touring each other's properties to observe practices firsthand. I served at these gatherings, invisible in the way that servants were always invisible to their owners. I poured whiskey and cleared plates while men discussed us as if we were cattle or horses, subjects for breeding programs, labor optimization studies, and what they euphemistically called motivation research. During one such gathering in the spring of 1834, a planter named Matthias Cutler from South Carolina presented what he called his graduated pressure system. He developed a methodology where small infractions received mild punishment, medium infractions received moderate punishment, and major infractions, defined as anything threatening the owner's authority or property, received what he termed erasure responses. The key, Cutler explained to the assembled owners, is that erasure must appear natural. A slave who simply vanishes creates dangerous speculation. But a slave who attempts escape and drowns in a river, or who falls ill and dies suddenly, or who is sold away for behavioral issues, these create cautionary narratives that the remaining slaves will internalize and transmit among themselves. Thomas nodded vigorously, making notes. This represented his philosophy articulated by someone else, validated by their independent arrival at identical conclusions. The documentation proves crucial, Cutler continued. Every erasure must be recorded with sufficient detail for future reference, yet vague enough that casual inspection reveals nothing incriminating. Dates, circumstances, witnesses, but always with plausible alternative explanations. I stood against the wall holding a pitcher of water, my face carefully blank, and contemplated Ruth's basket overturned by the river, Elijah's torn shirt found downstream, all the accidents and natural deaths Thomas had recorded in his journals with precisely the kind of calculated ambiguity Cutler was describing. After dinner that evening, as I cleared the study, I overheard Thomas and Cutler speaking in lower voices. The real challenge, Cutler said, is maintaining the erasure sites. Family members will search, field hands will speculate. You need a location accessible to you but psychologically off limits to them. I use the old cemetery, Thomas replied. Beyond the family plots, in the woods. The slaves won't go there. Too many superstitions about disturbing the dead, especially white dead. And it's sufficiently distant from the quarters that nighttime activity goes unnoticed. Cutler laughed. Elegant. I use a ravine on the southern boundary of my property. Steep sides, heavy vegetation. I tell them it's dangerous, that slaves have fallen and been injured, and they naturally avoid it. I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. These men were comparing notes on where to hide bodies the way other men might compare notes on where to store farm equipment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 14 stones in the clearing, about how Thomas had systematized even murder, transformed it into a methodology teachable and shareable, and I thought about all the other plantations, all the other clearings, ravines, and hidden places where testimony was being buried. The next morning, I made a decision that would shape the remaining years of my bondage. I would document everything, not in writing that could be discovered and destroyed, but in memory so detailed and organized that it could be reproduced years later if I survived to freedom. I started with the names and dates I already knew from Augustus's work. Then I added every piece of information I encountered, attendees at Thomas's symposiums, details from letters, conversations overheard while serving meals. I organized it all into mental categories: people, places, methods, justifications, evidence. It became a kind of meditation, this mental cataloging. At night, I would lie awake reviewing what I'd learned, testing my recall, ensuring nothing was forgotten. During the day, I would add new observations, cross-reference information, build connections between puzzle pieces. I was creating testimony existing only in my mind, yet more complete and damning than any physical document could be. By 1835, Richard had married Margaret, and the character of Riverside began shifting. Margaret brought Charleston sophistication to the plantation, parties and social gatherings having nothing to do with Thomas's experiments but everything to do with maintaining their status among Virginia's planter class. These gatherings created new observation opportunities. Wealthy guests would bring their own house servants, and in the kitchen and quarters we would exchange information. I learned about conditions on other plantations, about owners cruel or lenient, about places where slaves had successfully escaped and places where attempted flight meant certain death. One woman, a lady's maid named Celia from a Richmond household, told me about a network of free black people in the city who assisted fugitive slaves in reaching the North. She lacked details, such information proved too dangerous to share casually. But she confirmed that paths to freedom existed for those brave or desperate enough to attempt them. I contemplated running. I was young, educated, possessing skills that could help me pass as free if I reached Pennsylvania or New York. But I kept remembering Augustus's words, "You're going to outlive this place. And when you do, you're going to tell this story." Running meant saving myself. Staying meant preserving the testimony that could someday demonstrate the full scope of what slavery had been, not merely the familiar cruelties everyone knew about, but the calculated, systematic, scientifically justified dehumanization that men like Thomas Harrove had perfected. So I stayed, and I watched, and I remembered. In the summer of 1837, something occurred that crystallized everything I'd been observing into sharp, terrible focus. A new field hand arrived at Riverside, purchased at auction in Richmond. His name was Isaiah, and he was perhaps 19, strong and healthy, exactly the kind of worker Thomas preferred. But Isaiah possessed one characteristic that immediately caught Thomas's attention: he could read. His previous owner had been an elderly widow who'd permitted her house servants to become literate, ignoring Virginia's laws against slave education. When she died and her estate was liquidated, Isaiah was sold with this dangerous skill noted in the auction catalogue. Thomas purchased him specifically because of this literacy, seeing an opportunity for what he called a degradation study. He wanted to document how quickly an educated slave could be reduced to the mental state of an uneducated one through systematic deprivation and humiliation. I was ordered to teach Isaiah his duties in the tobacco fields. During those first few days, we had brief opportunities to speak. "He's going to attempt to break you," I warned Isaiah. "Not through physical punishment, that's too crude for him. He's going to try making you forget you can read. Forget you're anything more than what he says you are." Isaiah looked at me with eyes still holding hope. "Let him try. I know who I am. No man can take that from me." I wanted to tell him about the clearing in the woods, about the 14 stones, about what happened to people who held onto themselves too fiercely at Riverside. But I didn't. Perhaps I was a coward. Perhaps I believed he needed that hope to survive what was coming. Perhaps I simply couldn't bear being the one who crushed it. Thomas began his experiment immediately. He assigned Isaiah tasks requiring no thought, digging holes and filling them in, moving rocks from one pile to another and back again. Work deliberately meaningless and exhausting. He timed how long before Isaiah began showing signs of what Thomas called mental deterioration, depression, confusion, loss of initiative. I had to record all of it in the journals, Isaiah's responses, his attempts to maintain dignity, the slow erosion of his spirit under the weight of calculated absurdity. Thomas observed him like a naturalist observing an animal in captivity, noting every change in behavior or expression. After 3 months, Isaiah attempted escape. He made it nearly 15 miles before the dogs found him. They brought him back torn and bleeding, and Thomas had him whipped. Not excessively, just enough to serve as an example to the other field hands. But the real punishment came afterward. Thomas informed Isaiah that he was being moved to the main house as a servant, ostensibly a reward for surviving his punishment. Yet I understood Thomas's true purpose. He was placing Isaiah where he could be observed more closely, where his continued existence would serve as a living demonstration of what happened to slaves who tried escaping their assigned roles. Isaiah became a ghost in his own skin. He performed his duties with mechanical precision, speaking only when spoken to, his eyes fixed on nothing. The young man who'd insisted that no one could strip away his sense of self had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt as exactly what Thomas wanted, an obedient, thoughtless piece of property. One evening, as I filed papers in the study, Thomas looked up from his journal and addressed me directly. "Do you comprehend what you're witnessing with Isaiah, Samuel?" I kept my voice neutral. "No, sir. I'm documenting the transformation of consciousness under controlled conditions. Isaiah arrived here with an inflated sense of his own capabilities. Literacy created in him the illusion of equality. I've stripped away that illusion and returned him to his natural state. It's not cruelty. It's correction." He gestured at his journals. "All of this, everything I've accomplished here for 30 years, has served to demonstrate that slavery isn't a moral wrong. It's a social necessity. Your people lack capacity for self-governance. You require structure, guidance, control. And the evidence resides right here, documented and reproducible. I regarded this man who'd owned me for 28 years, who'd murdered my sister, who'd sold my father, who'd spent decades converting human suffering into data points for his philosophical justifications. And I saw finally not a monster, but something more pathetic, a man who needed so desperately to believe in his own righteousness that he'd constructed an entire intellectual edifice to avoid confronting the simple truth that what he did for profit he justified with science." "Yes, sir," I said, because that was the only safe response. "But I thought, you can write all the justifications you desire. You can document and measure and theorize, but testimony will outlast your theories. The truth will outlast your lies." That night, I added Isaiah's story to my mental catalogue, another piece of evidence in the case I was building against Thomas Harrove and everyone like him. By 1840, Thomas's health had begun declining. He was 61, and decades of plantation management had worn him down. His hands shook when he wrote, and sometimes I'd find him in the study staring at his journals with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not regret exactly, but something approaching bewilderment, as if he couldn't comprehend how he'd arrived at this point in his life. My mother died that year. Her heart, the doctor said, though I knew it was the accumulated grief of 3 decades in bondage. She'd lost a husband and a daughter. She'd watched her surviving children navigate the impossible maze of plantation life. And finally, her body had simply refused to carry the weight any longer. Thomas recorded her death in his journals with clinical detachment, female, age 51. House servant, died of heart failure. Total years of service, 31. Total offspring produced, 3, 1 sold, 1 deceased, 1 remaining. Economic value at death, minimal due to age and declining health. That was my mother's life, reduced to a legenitation. I stood at her grave in the slave cemetery, not the clearing where Ruth was buried, but the official burial ground where publicly acknowledgeable deaths were marked with wooden crosses, and made her a promise: I would survive this place. I would carry the testimony forward, and someday someone would know her name and her story in a context recognizing her humanity rather than reducing her to economic calculations. After her death, I had no one left at Riverside who bound me through love. Mary was married and living on a neighboring plantation. The other slaves were friends and companions, but they weren't family in the way that creates obligations stronger than self-preservation. For the first time in my life, I was truly free to plan my own path forward, even while remaining legally enslaved. That's when I began seriously contemplating what Augustus had told me years earlier, that I would outlive this place, and when I did, I would tell the story. I started thinking beyond survival to purpose, beyond endurance to testimony. The world was changing around us in ways even plantation owners couldn't completely control. Abolitionist literature was spreading despite laws against it. The Underground Railroad was growing more organized. Tensions between North and South were escalating toward some future confrontation that everyone sensed but no one could quite predict. And Thomas Hargrove's experiment in scientific slavery was beginning to appear less like the future and more like a desperate attempt to justify an institution slowly revealing itself as not merely morally wrong, but economically and socially unsustainable. In 1842, everything began accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. A slave from a neighboring plantation, a man named Henry who'd been hired to work at Riverside during harvest season, escaped and made it all the way to Pennsylvania before capture. His escape made headlines in the Richmond papers, both as a cautionary tale about the dangers of granting slaves too much independence and as a celebration of the Fugitive Slave Act's effectiveness. But Henry had maintained a journal during his flight north. Portions were published in abolitionist newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston. In that journal, he described conditions on Virginia plantations based on stories he'd heard from other slaves. He wrote about places where slaves vanished without explanation, where owners kept detailed records of human endurance, where the machinery of bondage had been refined into something systematic and calculating. He never named Riverside specifically, but the details aligned closely enough, the journals, the experiments, the documented erasures, that several of Thomas's correspondents in his scientific slavery network sent urgent letters warning him to destroy any evidence that could be used against them if political winds shifted. For the first time in my memory, I witnessed Thomas Hargrove genuinely afraid. He spent a week in his study, going through decades of journals and correspondence. He burned page after page in the fireplace, the smoke sometimes so thick that Richard had to open windows to keep the room breathable. They destroyed letters from other plantation owners, detailed observations about slave psychology and behavior, carefully documented accounts of erasures and their effectiveness as social controls. They attempted to erase the evidence of what they'd done, but they failed to realize how incomplete that erasure would be. I'd already memorized the most crucial information from those journals. I'd hidden certain key letters, those most explicitly describing the network of owners experimenting with systematic dehumanization, in a space beneath a floorboard in the quarters. And several field hands had been maintaining oral histories, passing stories from person to person, ensuring that even if every physical record burned, the testimony would survive in memory. On August 17, 1842, Thomas summoned me to his study one final time. The room smelled of smoke and old paper. His hands shook as he gestured for me to sit, the first time in 33 years he'd ever offered me a chair in his presence. "Samuel," he said, his voice rough with age and something that might have been shame. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else. I'm dying. The doctor in Richmond confirmed it last month. Something in my lungs, probably from all this smoke." He laughed bitterly. "Appropriate, I suppose. Killed by my own attempt to hide the evidence." I waited, saying nothing. "I brought you here because you're the only person remaining who understands what I tried to accomplish at Riverside. Augustus is gone. Richard believes I was simply an efficient plantation manager. But you know the truth. You've read the journals. You've copied the letters. You know about the experiments, the documentation, the entire philosophical framework I constructed to justify it all. He produced a journal I hadn't seen before, newer than the others, with his cramped handwriting filling every page. This is my final confession, I suppose. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and you bear no obligation to give it. But I need someone to understand what I learned after 33 years of attempting to perfect the science of owning human beings. He pushed the journal across the desk toward me. The fundamental question I was trying to answer was this: how do you maintain an institution that you know in your deepest soul is morally indefensible? How do you own people when you've read Locke and Jefferson and understand that all men are created equal? How do you participate in systematic dehumanization when your own Christianity teaches that every soul possesses value? Thomas leaned back in his chair, appearing impossibly old. The answer, I discovered, was that you make it a science. You convince yourself that you're not merely exercising power arbitrarily, but gathering knowledge. You tell yourself that your observations possess value, that someone someday will use your documentation to create a more humane system. You construct elaborate intellectual justifications for treating human beings as experimental subjects. You lie to yourself so thoroughly and consistently that you almost believe it. And the people you killed, I asked, abandoning the pretense of deference that had protected me for so long. Ruth, Elijah, the 12 others in that clearing. What scientific purpose did they serve? Thomas met my eyes, and I witnessed something I'd never seen before: acknowledgement. They served the purpose of maintaining the lie. Every time someone threatened to expose the fundamental cruelty at the heart of what I was doing, by escaping or questioning too loudly or simply existing as evidence of their own humanity, they had to be removed. Each erasure was documented, their circumstances recorded, their deaths analyzed for what they revealed about human psychology under extreme duress. But the real purpose was simpler. They died so I could continue pretending that what I was doing was science rather than slavery. He opened the journal and showed me pages filled with names and dates. This is the complete record. Everyone who disappeared from Riverside over 33 years, 27 people, not 14. The clearing holds only those from the early years before I refined the methodology. The others were sold away to traders specializing in making people vanish into the deeper south. Or they died in ways attributable to accident or illness. But I knew. I always knew. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm dying, Samuel. And I need there to be a witness. Not to absolve me, and nothing can accomplish that. But to confirm that I understood what I was doing, that I knew it was evil. And I did it anyway because the alternative, admitting that everything Virginia society was built upon was a crime against humanity, was more terrifying than any individual act of cruelty. He closed the journal and pushed it toward me. This is yours now. Hide it. Burn it. Publish it when you're free. I don't care. But someone needs to know that I knew, that we all knew. Every plantation owner who participated in this system understood on some level that we were committing crimes that would eventually be judged by history. We merely hoped we'd be dead before that judgment arrived. I picked up the journal, feeling its weight in my hands. I'll testify, I said quietly. But not for you. For them. For Ruth and Elijah and every person you documented and destroyed. That's the testimony the world needs, not your confession, but their existence. Not your guilt, but their humanity. Thomas nodded slowly, and for just a moment, I observed genuine understanding pass between us. Not forgiveness, never forgiveness, but mutual recognition of what we'd both been part of, him as architect, me as witness. Then I suppose we understand each other one final time, he said. He died 8 months later, in April of 1843. I was 34 years old and had spent all but 9 years of my life in bondage to men who converted human beings into experiments and called it science. Just when you believe you comprehend the full horror of what slavery contained, the depths prove even darker than imagined. If this testimony affects you, if you believe these stories require preservation and sharing, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. The conclusion of Samuel's account will demonstrate how testimony survives even when everything else is destroyed. Let's continue. After Thomas's death in 1843, Richard inherited full control of Riverside along with all its debts, declining productivity, and the weight of his father's legacy. He was 35, married with 2 young children, and facing an economic reality that Thomas's scientific experiments had done nothing to solve. Virginia tobacco farming was becoming unsustainable. For 3 years, Richard attempted to maintain the plantation in something approximating its former operation. But his heart wasn't invested the way Thomas's had been. Richard had grown up watching his father's obsessive documentation, had witnessed the symposiums and experiments, and somewhere along the way, he developed a kind of exhausted resignation about the entire enterprise of slavery. He wasn't kind. Kindness wasn't something plantation owners could afford economically or socially, but he wasn't actively cruel either. He simply managed us the way he managed the tobacco crops and equipment, as assets requiring maintenance at minimum cost until they could be sold or used up. I continued my work in the main house, managing records and correspondence. But now I also possessed Thomas's final journal hidden in the same space beneath the floorboards where I'd secreted the most incriminating letters years earlier. That journal constituted a complete confession, 27 names, dates, circumstances, and Thomas's own analysis of how he'd systematized murder and called it plantation management. It was testimony waiting for a world that might someday be ready to receive it. The mid-1840s proved turbulent years across the South. Texas annexation opened new territory to slavery's expansion, but it also intensified political debates between North and South. The question of whether slavery would spread or be contained was becoming the central crisis of American politics, and even enslaved people on remote Virginia plantations could sense that some fundamental confrontation was approaching. In the quarters, we spoke carefully about what we heard from hired hands arriving from other plantations, from free black people occasionally doing business with Riverside, from the fragments of newspaper stories we could access. A world existed beyond the plantation boundaries where our status as human beings was being debated, contested, and slowly, far too slowly, recognized. In late 1846, several things occurred almost simultaneously that would transform everything. First, Richard received notice that his largest creditors in Richmond were calling in their loans. The plantation's productivity had declined steadily over the previous decade, and the collateral he'd used, the land and property of Riverside, was no longer considered sufficient security. Second, Margaret became ill with the same kind of wasting disease that had killed Thomas's first wife, Catherine. The Richmond doctors were baffled. They prescribed treatments accomplishing nothing except draining Richard's remaining capital. And third, I made a decision that I'd been delaying for 4 years since Thomas's death. On November 12, 1846, I set fire to the main house at Riverside. I'd waited until I was certain Richard and his family were away from the building. I'd warned the house servants to be nowhere near the structure that night, telling them I'd heard strange sounds that might indicate structural problems. And then in the hour before dawn, I carried a lamp into Thomas's study, tipped it over onto the curtains, and walked away as the room filled with flames. The official story, which Richard told the insurance investigators and the county sheriff, was that a lamp had been accidentally knocked over during the night. Terrible tragedy. Complete destruction of the main house. But thankfully, the family had been staying with Margaret's parents in Richmond during her illness. Yet I knew the truth. I destroyed Thomas Hargrove's legacy, burned every remaining journal, every piece of correspondence, every shred of his documentation project that hadn't already been hidden or memorized. What I couldn't destroy, what I'd carefully preserved, were the hidden letters and Thomas's final confession. Those I'd wrapped in oilcloth and buried in 3 separate locations on the property, marked with stones resembling any other river rock, but that I would recognize years later if I survived to retrieve them. The fire changed everything at Riverside. Richard lacked the capital to rebuild the main house. His creditors, already nervous about the plantation's viability, refused to extend additional credit. Margaret's medical expenses continued mounting, and the political climate was shifting in ways making Virginia plantation ownership increasingly uncertain. By spring of 1847, Richard had made the decision Thomas had resisted for 3 decades. He would sell Riverside piece by piece and move his family to Richmond, where he could establish himself in some commercial enterprise not dependent on the increasingly precarious economics of plantation slavery. The land was sold to a speculator planning to subdivide it. The equipment was auctioned off. And yes, the slaves were sold, some in groups, some individually, scattered to other plantations across Virginia and the deeper South. I was sold to a Richmond merchant named Harrison Collins, who needed a clerk for his dry goods business. He was a businessman with no interest in plantation management or experiments in human endurance. He simply wanted someone capable of reading, writing, maintaining organized accounts, and managing his correspondence with suppliers. My sale to Collins represented, in a sense, a promotion within the hierarchy of slavery. Working in a city environment, I would enjoy more autonomy, better conditions, and access to a wider world than I'd ever known at Riverside. Yet I remained enslaved, still property, still subject to being sold again if Collins's business failed or his needs changed. Before I departed Riverside for the final time, I returned to the clearing beyond the cemetery. The 14 stones remained, though many were now covered with vines and leaf litter. I stood among them and spoke the names I remembered, bearing witness one final time to the lives Thomas Hargrove had attempted to erase: Ruth Pritchard, Elijah Turner, Thomas Freeman, Sarah Boyd, Daniel Matthews, Grace Taylor, Moses Wells, Isaac Henry, Benjamin Crawford, Esther Crawford, Rebecca Johnson, Joshua Parker, Solomon Hayes, Matthew Dixon, and one whose name was never recorded, buried there before my birth. 15 testimonies, not 14. I'd me counted as a child. 15 people whose existence had been reduced to stones and memories. I promised them that I would survive to tell their stories. That someday when freedom came, if freedom came, I would return and speak their names in a world recognizing their humanity. Then I walked away from Riverside for what I believed would be the last time. Life in Richmond represented a different kind of bondage. Collins treated me less like property and more like an employee he didn't have to pay, which was of course exactly what I was. I worked in his shop during the day, managing inventory and customer accounts. At night, I was permitted to sleep in a small room above the store with access to Collins's personal library. For the first time in my life, I enjoyed hours of relative freedom. Collins didn't watch me constantly the way Thomas had. As long as the shop's accounts balanced and customers were satisfied, he left me largely alone. I used that freedom to educate myself further. I read everything I could access about the abolitionist movement, about the political debates over slavery's expansion, about the legal theories and constitutional arguments being advanced on both sides. I read Frederick Douglass's narrative when I discovered a hidden copy in a shipment of used books. I read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin when it was published in 1852, recognizing in her fictional account many of the real horrors I'd witnessed. And I continued my mental documentation, now adding observations about urban slavery, about how the system functioned differently in cities than on plantations, about the ways enslaved people in Richmond created communities and networks impossible under the totalizing surveillance of plantation life. I encountered other enslaved and free black people who participated in underground networks, not the famous Underground Railroad that assisted escape to the north, but subtler networks that passed information, provided mutual aid, and maintained connections between scattered families. Through these networks, I learned that Augustus had died in Alabama in 1836, 8 years after being sold away from Riverside. But before his death, he taught literacy to 6 other slaves on the cotton plantation where he'd been sent. And those 6 had taught others. His testimony, like his teachings, had multiplied and spread in ways Thomas Hargrove could never have documented or controlled. I learned that my father, Jacob, had been sold twice more after leaving Riverside, ending up on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. He died there in 1841, 11 years after I'd last seen him. The records listed his cause of death as fever, but I knew that in Louisiana sugar country, fever was often what they called death by exhaustion. I learned that my sister Mary and her husband Daniel had attempted escape from the neighboring plantation where they'd been married. They'd been caught, and Daniel had been sold to a Mississippi plantation as punishment. Mary had been kept in Virginia but moved to a harsher situation as an example to other slaves. She died in 1849, the circumstances unclear in the fragmentary information I received. By 1850, I was 41 years old, and I'd been enslaved for 32 of those years, 28 at Riverside, 5 in Richmond. Everyone I'd been connected to by blood was dead. But I'd survived, and I'd maintained the testimony that Augustus had charged me to preserve. The 1850s were a decade of accelerating crisis. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to balance free and slave states but only intensified conflicts. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 led to violence in the territories. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that black people possessed no rights white people were bound to respect. And through it all, I worked in Harrison Collins's shop, watched the political situation deteriorate, and waited for the confrontation everyone knew was approaching. When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in 1859, the reaction in Richmond was panic and rage. White Virginians saw in Brown's attempt to spark a slave rebellion confirmation of their worst fears, that the North wanted to destroy Southern society through violence, that abolitionists would arm slaves and encourage massacre. The reality was that most enslaved people weren't waiting for white abolitionists to save us. We were navigating our own paths to survival and, when possible, freedom. But Brown's raid accelerated the march toward war in ways that would eventually reshape everything. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and 7 Southern states seceded before he even took office. Virginia initially resisted secession. But after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops, the state voted to leave the Union in April 1861. Richmond became the capital of the Confederacy, and the city transformed into a military center. Soldiers filled the streets, government offices took over buildings, and enslaved people like me found ourselves in a strange liminal space. Still legally property, yet living in a city increasingly chaotic and under threat of invasion. Collins became a supplier for Confederate forces, and his business initially thrived on military contracts. But as the war progressed and the Union blockade tightened, shortages became severe. By 1863, Richmond was under siege conditions, food was scarce, and Collins's business was failing. He grew desperate and erratic, drinking heavily and making poor business decisions. In early 1865, as Union forces closed in on Richmond, he simply fled the city, joining the stream of Confederate officials and wealthy civilians evacuating before federal occupation. He left everything behind, his shop, his inventory, his property, including me. For several days, I simply continued working in the shop, managing what little remained of the inventory, as if Collins would return at any moment. But the Confederate government was collapsing. Union troops were approaching. And the entire social order that had defined my life for 56 years was disintegrating around me. On April 3, 1865, Union forces entered Richmond. I stood in the doorway of Collins's shop and watched blue-coated soldiers march through streets filled with smoke from fires set by retreating Confederates. I watched enslaved people emerge from houses and workplaces, some celebrating, some frightened, all uncertain about what came next. Freedom arrived not as a dramatic moment of liberation, but as a quiet realization that no one was coming to claim me anymore. The legal framework that had defined me as property had collapsed. I was, for the first time in my life, recognized by the government as a human being with agency and rights. I was 56 years old. I'd spent all but 9 years of my life in bondage. But I'd survived. And I'd maintained the testimony. What does one do with freedom when it finally arrives after decades of waiting? For some people, freedom meant moving immediately, going north, searching for family members sold away years earlier, starting completely new lives in places that had never known them as slaves. For me, freedom meant testimony. It meant returning to Riverside and retrieving what I had hidden. It meant speaking the names of the dead into whatever future might listen. In the summer of 1865, 3 months after the Confederate surrender, I made my way back to what had been Riverside Plantation. The journey took 3 days on foot. Richmond was still occupied by Union forces, and the countryside was devastated, burned buildings, abandoned fields, former slaves, and former slave owners trying to figure out how to navigate a world turned upside down. The property that had been Riverside had changed hands twice during the war. The main house remained a burnt-out ruin. No one had rebuilt it. The quarters where we'd lived were abandoned, though some structures still stood. The fields were overgrown, the tobacco barns collapsing. I went first to the clearing beyond the cemetery. The 15 stones remained, though even more overgrown than before. I knelt beside each one and spoke the names again, this time as a free man bearing witness. Then I proceeded to the 3 locations where I'd buried Thomas's final confession and the most incriminating letters. 2 of the caches remained intact, the oilcloth still sound, the documents readable despite for years underground. The 3rd had been disturbed, probably by an animal or erosion, and the papers inside were too damaged to salvage. But I possessed enough. I had Thomas's confession. I had letters from plantation owners discussing their experiments in systematic dehumanization. I had my own testimony carried in memory for decades. I brought everything to the Freedmen's Bureau in Richmond, the federal agency established to assist former slaves in navigating their new freedom. I told my story to a young officer from Massachusetts named Lieutenant James Whitfield, no relation to the North Carolina planter who'd corresponded with Thomas years earlier. Whitfield listened to my account with growing amazement. He examined the documents, made careful notes, posed detailed questions. He was particularly interested in the network of plantation owners who'd been experimenting with what Thomas had called scientific slavery. This is evidence of conspiracy, Whitfield said, examining the letters. Multiple owners coordinating methods, sharing information, essentially creating a systematic approach to human rights violations. Can they be prosecuted? I asked. Whitfield hesitated. It's complicated. Many of them are dead. Others are protected by amnesty agreements. And frankly, the legal system is overwhelmed with more immediate concerns, reuniting families, establishing labor contracts, addressing violence against freed people. He saw my expression and added quickly. But this requires preservation. This is historical evidence that shouldn't be lost. I'll ensure it's included in the Bureau's records, and you should formally give testimony, create a written account for preservation. Over the following several weeks, I worked with Whitfield to create a formal written testimony. I told him everything, the 37 years of my captivity, Thomas's experiments, the disappearances, Augustus's counter-ledger, the symposiums where plantation owners compared methodologies, the network of men who tried to transform slavery into a science. Whitfield recorded it all in careful handwriting, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions or verify details against the documents I'd provided. When we finished, the testimony comprised 43 pages, the longest single account in the Richmond Freedmen's Bureau files. What happens to this now? I asked. It gets filed with all the other testimonies we're gathering, Whitfield said. Thousands of accounts from across the South about what slavery actually entailed. Someday historians will use these records to understand this period. Your testimony will contribute to that understanding. It wasn't precisely justice. The men who'd participated in Thomas's network were mostly dead or beyond prosecution reach. The legal system slowly being reformed to recognize black testimony wasn't equipped to prosecute crimes committed when that testimony would have been inadmissible. But it was something. It was truth entering the official record, impossible to erase or deny. In 1872, 7 years after emancipation, I learned that one of the letters I'd preserved, a particularly detailed one from Matthias Cutler in South Carolina describing his graduated pressure system and erasure responses, had made its way to a congressional committee investigating post-war violence and exploitation in the South. A representative from Massachusetts, a man named George Boutwell, read portions of the letter into the official congressional record during a debate about federal enforcement of civil rights protections for freed people. He used it as evidence that slavery hadn't been merely a labor system, but a comprehensive program of dehumanization that its practitioners had consciously designed and refined. Thomas Hargrove's philosophy, his careful justifications for converting human suffering into data, became part of the documented history of slavery's intellectual foundations. It still wasn't justice, but it was testimony that couldn't be burned or buried. I lived in Richmond for the remainder of my life, working first for the Freedmen's Bureau and later as a teacher in one of the schools established for formerly enslaved people. I taught literacy and mathematics, but I also taught history, the history of what we'd survived, the history that official accounts attempted to soften or ignore. I married in 1868 a woman named Sarah who'd been enslaved on a North Carolina plantation and had walked to Richmond after emancipation searching for a sister sold away during the war. We never found her sister, but we built a life together, and we had 3 children who grew up free in ways we'd never imagined possible. I never forgot Riverside. I never forgot the names of the people buried in that clearing, and I never stopped testifying about what I'd witnessed during my 37 years of captivity. In 1879, I was invited to speak at a convention of former slaves in Washington, D.C. Nearly 500 people attended, men and women who'd survived bondage and were now building lives in freedom, but who understood that our testimonies required preservation before we died and our stories died with us. I told them about Thomas Harrove and his experiments. I told them about Augustus and his counterledger. I told them about the network of plantation owners who'd attempted to render slavery scientific and humane while committing atrocities they carefully documented in private journals. And I told them why testimony mattered, not merely for history but for the future, because the children growing up free needed to understand what freedom had cost, because the white people who wanted to pretend slavery had been a benign institution needed to confront the documented evidence of what it actually was, because truth possessed value transcending immediate justice or personal vindication. After my talk, an elderly woman approached me. She was perhaps 70, with grey hair and eyes that had witnessed too much. I was at a plantation in South Carolina, she said quietly. The owner there kept journals like the man you described. He called it his management archive. After the war, I went back and tried to find those journals, but they'd been burned. I thought the evidence was lost. It's not lost if you remember it, I told her. Our memories are testimony. Our survival is testimony. They tried to reduce us to numbers in their ledgers, but we're still here speaking our own truths. She nodded slowly. Then I suppose I should start writing it down. Yes, I said. Write it all down. Because testimony survives. I'm 75 years old now, writing this in 1884. I've outlived all the Harroves I knew, Thomas, Richard, even young Richard Jr., who died last year in Richmond. I've outlived most of the people I was enslaved with, though I've maintained contact with the few survivors and attempted to document their stories alongside my own. The clearing at Riverside is completely overgrown now. The property has been subdivided and sold multiple times. Modern houses stand where the tobacco fields used to be. No historical marker indicates what occurred there. No monument acknowledges the 15 people buried beyond the cemetery. Yet I know they're there. And I've ensured their names are recorded in multiple locations, in the Freedmen's Bureau files, in my written testimony, in the oral histories I've shared with my children and students, in this account I'm writing now. Testimony survives. That's what Augustus taught me. That's what I've attempted to pass forward. The world differs now from what it was during my childhood in bondage. Black people vote, hold office, own property, educate our children. The changes are fragile, and people labor to undo them, but they're real. The legal framework that defined human beings as property has been destroyed. Yet the psychological and social frameworks, the beliefs about racial hierarchies, the justifications for inequality, the tendency to reduce human beings to economic or political abstractions, those survive in more subtle forms. That's why testimony matters. That's why the truth about what slavery actually was, not what people prefer to remember it being, must be preserved and repeated. This is my testimony about what I witnessed during 37 years of captivity at Riverside Plantation in Virginia. It's the testimony of Ruth Pritchard, who asked too many questions and was buried in an unmarked grave. It's the testimony of Augustus, who created a counterledger and was sold away for his trouble. It's the testimony of Elijah Turner, Isaiah, and 13 others whose names might otherwise be forgotten. It's testimony about how human cruelty can be systematized, documented, and justified by intelligent people who convince themselves they're acting scientifically rather than merely exercising power. And it's testimony about how truth survives in memory, in hidden documents, in stories passed from person to person, in the simple fact of survival itself. What do you think of this account? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or are there questions that should still be asked about how slavery was practiced and justified? Leave your comment below with your thoughts about Samuel's testimony and what it reveals about history's hidden crimes. If you desire more stories that have been buried or forgotten, histories that challenge comfortable narratives and force us to confront uncomfortable truths, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. These stories must be told even when they're difficult to hear. Especially when they're difficult to hear. Share this video with someone who believes that understanding history, no matter how painful, is essential to building a better future. Leave a comment sharing where you're from and what this testimony means to you. This is Samuel Pritchard's testimony given in his own words about 37 years of captivity and what he witnessed during that time. May it serve as one small piece of the great ledger that history is still compiling, a ledger recognizing the humanity of those who suffered, the crimes of those who profited, and the importance of testimony that refuses to be silenced.